Got a really exciting session today. Looking forward to this conversation so much. Biljana Cvetanovski, partner at McKinsey. We're going to be talking about the three factors that really play into growth success. So with that, I'm excited to get to it and welcome Biljana to the virtual stage.
Hi, David.
Hey, it's so great to see you. Thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me.
Well, let's get into it because we have so much to cover, like the entire future of the marketing industry and a mere 20 minutes to do it. And we will be taking Q&A. So I have about 74 questions I'll be throwing at you, and then we'll add about 30 or 60 more from the audience. And then we'll see if we've
I'm ready.
All right. So first, you were the architect of McKinsey's recent research that looked at, I believe, 860 executives around the world at how they approach marketing, how they have approached success or lack thereof, and the factors that went into that. Your research, maybe a bit of a spoiler alert by the name of our session today, but your research found that there were three factors that, especially when used together, had this super cumulative effect on growth, which we'll get into in the specifics. But tell us about those three magical factors.
Happy to. And just a bit of the context on the research, as we all know, the last 18 months, we've had an incredible amount of disruption. And with COVID-19, first and foremost, being a humanitarian crisis, we saw so much disruption to the way businesses operate. We saw almost 10 years of digital adoption in the first 100 days, consumers changing loyalty, 3 out of every 4 consumers changing the products they buy, the brands they buy, the channels they buy them in. And it's not just a B2C issue, we also see it in B2B with the onset of more omni-channel. So this research, we've been running research over a number of years to really look at, what are the capabilities that drive growth, and how does marketing and the chief marketing officer help deliver on that growth? And with this research, what we found is a number of striking insights. And we looked at a number of companies, as you said, 860 from around the world, different size companies, different industries. And what we found is, firstly, 78% of CEOs are looking to marketing and the chief marketing officer to deliver on growth, not only design the growth agenda, but deliver on growth. And what's particularly striking is that this held true in 2019 and in 2020. So even in the height of disruption, CEOs are looking to CMOs and marketing to deliver on growth. We also found the growth triple play, as you mentioned, this intersection of creativity, analytics, and purpose. Companies that are doing all three, they're outgrowing their peers by at least a multiple of 2x. This is irrespective of industry or sector or geography. And what we also found is more. So the more of the growth triple play that you do, the more you grow. And maybe very finally, the most striking insight we found is that even though these concepts of creativity, analytics, and purpose are not new, only 7% of companies are delivering on all three. So it's quite a difficult hurdle. So even though they're not new capabilities, doing all three is particularly challenging.
Well, I think anecdotally, we all know that to be true, right? That there are brands you think of as they're tremendously creative, but they may seem to lack the data to really leverage that creativity. And there are ones that seem to really lean into their purpose, but then lack the tactics to really get them out there and the data, especially to make them personable. And I wanted to go back just a step, because to your point about this era of disruption we've been in, I love that you have referred to this era of the new normal as no normal. So tell us about what does that mean, but then also more importantly, what does that mean for marketers?
We do refer to this new no normal. And that's essentially, we've seen so much disruption. And if you think about marketers and CMOs and executives, they've either had to rewrite the playbook or completely scrap the playbook. So it's really about rethinking, how do you go after growth? And what we've learned with marketers is that when we looked at the growth triple play, companies that were really focusing in on the creativity, analytics, and purpose and executing against that, they were able to drive above peer growth. So this new normal, really, it means it's a once in a generation opportunity for marketers to step into this growth agenda, and they have the permission of the CEO, and the CEO actually wants the CMO and marketing to step into that role. So what it means for marketers is really double down on these capabilities that matter, and they've been proven to show above market growth even in the most disruptive of times.
Yeah, and it's interesting too that each of these, whether it's creativity or analytics or purpose, each of these is effective in its own way. 6% for one, 7% for two, but it jumps right to 12% growth once you use all three. That's a pretty noticeable jump from just using 2 or 3 when you form the full Voltron here of having all three in one place.
Absolutely, and you're spot on. It's really the intersection. And what we saw growth triple play companies doing really well is that they're infusing analytics into their creativity. So they're getting a 360-degree view of their customer. They're injecting very granular real-time insights, and they're creating relevant content in a real-time way that they can speak to their consumers with. And that makes it a much more personal and human experience for consumers. They're also thinking about infusing purpose into their analytics. And that means they're very intentional about how they communicate or how they analyze their data. And they also put purpose as their guiding light, really the North Star of the organization. And it's not just about paying lip service to purpose, it's really about making tough calls around your purpose. So for example, we saw that growth triple play companies, they were 3 times more likely to remove legacy brands and legacy products from their portfolio if they didn't meet the bar on purpose. And we saw them really shaking up their ecosystem and making sure that their partners understood their purpose and were helping them build on that purpose as well.
Yeah, it's like that old saying, it's only a principle when it costs you money. If you can make the hard choices when there's still money on the line, and I want to get into purpose a bit more in a bit, because that's a huge topic. And I think it's one that, to your point, a lot of brands just don't, they all say they do. Like every brand says they have, their beliefs, their purpose, their mission statement. Very few really act on it in a really effective way. We're going to get to that in a second, but I wanted to go over creativity because it's easy to gloss over this. I think everyone's like, yeah, of course our marketing's creative. Of course we have creative solutions. But what you're talking about when you say creativity as part of this triple play, it goes beyond just good visuals, good writing, kind of the stuff that we think of as traditional creativity. How do you, or I guess either how do you define creativity in these purposes, or just how did you find creativity being defined in this research?
It's a great question. And creativity, as you mentioned, it's much broader than thinking about sort of content or creative. We often think about, marketing with a capital M here. It's about how does that creativity really embed itself in the entire customer journey. So how are you making sure that your communications are touching consumers in the right way at the right time in the customer journey? And as I mentioned earlier, it really is about dynamic content. It's about creating these real-time relevant messages that can reach consumers, again, where they want to be reached in a way they want to be spoken to. If you think about consumers, the up-and-coming consumers like Gen Z, we've done recent research around them that says they don't really think about creativity and channels in the way that previous consumers do. They really think about an omni-channel experience, and they really judge brands based on how seamless an experience is or how seamless a communication is, rather than thinking about it in terms of a specific comm or a specific channel that they're being contacted through.
Yeah, and obviously these play very closely together when you talk about the data and the creativity side, because there's nothing more jarring than when you get a tremendously mistargeted ad in one of your feeds or in one of your apps, and the creativity really is what makes it jarring, because you're like, wow, that is not at all who I am. And so I think a lot of people think that creativity and data are somehow disconnected, but whoa, you get them right together and you have really successful growth. You get them wrong and it is just jarring, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think you're also touching on a critical point around the analytics. And I think what we've seen with growth triple play companies, so the analytics that are feeding your creativity are really critical. And what we've noticed is that high growth companies, they have a clear data strategy, a clear digital and analytics strategy, and they know it's a competitive advantage. And they're constantly feeding those insights back into the organization to help feed the creative. And they're thinking about proprietary insights. They're not just thinking about, using the same data as their peers or competitors in the same way at the same time. So it's really about getting intimate with consumers in terms of understanding the data and then feeding that back in a very dynamic way so that you can target those messages and they're not jarring as you described.
Well, and obviously, as we mentioned, purpose is a big part of that messaging. And it's also, to me, the easiest part to get wrong. Creative, I think you can go a lot of different ways, but you get your purpose messaging wrong, and it really can derail everything you're trying. So let's talk a little bit about that. I think every brand will probably point you to a mission statement and say, of course, we have these guiding principles. But in terms of how they really activate it, I think a lot of brands still think of it as almost like a liability, like, well, we don't want to get really opinionated. We don't want to get political. We don't want to get polarizing. But at the same time, your research has found, and I think we've all seen over this last year or two, that it can actually have a really magnifying effect on your marketing effectiveness.
It really can, David. And I think what's critical here is authenticity and intentionality around your purpose. And if your brand is about fun, focus on fun. If it's about ESG issues, so it's really about being authentic to that purpose. And what we've seen growth triple play companies do really well is integrate it into every action every day. So they're rallying their employees around their purpose. They're writing talent strategies for future hires that's deeply embedded in that purpose. They're also streamlining their portfolio. As I mentioned earlier, they're removing brands and products from their portfolio that no longer hit that purpose. They're also thinking about their ecosystem of partners and making sure there's awareness around that. So there is this element of authenticity, intentionality, but also you can't pay lip service to purpose. Consumers, customers, partners, they see right through that. So there's something really strong about being authentic and building that trust around the purpose that you're communicating.
Well, this is the perfect place to nerd out on data. So we're definitely going to do that. I think this is one of the few beloved crowds that will really appreciate it. So let's definitely move on to the analytics and data part of the triple play. First, I want to give a quick reminder to everyone watching that we'd love to get your questions. We'll try to leave as much time as we can for them. So hit those with us and we'll tackle them in just under 10 minutes. So get those in. I also want to remind you of the stakes we're talking about. I mean, we're talking about if you can nail all three of these pillars, 12% growth, that's pretty fantastic. And will be more important than ever coming out of this period of disruption. So just to remind people that we're not just talking about high level principles here. This is big money, big growth, and really the future of a business can be defined by these. So let's talk. I feel like you can't talk about data without talking about consumer expectations, which is something that is a conversation people can go a lot of different ways. I think we talk a lot about the expectations of privacy, the expectations of being safe with people's data. I think everyone in this audience understands that. But let's talk about the consumer's expectation of how this data will be used to make a more seamless experience, to make something that it just works the way they want it to.
Yes, and I think that's a really critical point. And with consumers, there is an interest in a value exchange, and they, if I give you the data, then I want to be communicated to in a way that works for me. And I think that's super critical to think through what are the data implications. And we've all seen this kind of emergence of changing data laws. But really what it's about is a value exchange, David, I think ultimately. So consumers are really looking forward to, I will share my information if there's value in it for me. And I think if you anchor that again in your purpose and being clear that you won't, you're working in line with your purpose, I think consumers have quite an expectation that you can meet that need for them.
And I think we're all used to measuring creativity, right? A/B testing and just testing all your variants of all your creative, that goes back forever. And we're all used to it. It feels like we're just kind of waking up as an industry to the realities of measuring against purpose and making sure that you're not just getting the right results, but that you're asking the right questions, that you're measuring the right things. How have you seen purpose integrating with these analytics in terms of how they're measuring to make sure that they're actually seeing whether they're being true to their principles?
I think that's a fantastic point. And what we've seen is that it's integrated again in every measure and every part of the creativity and analytics that's run. So we typically we start with this data strategy, and around that data strategy, there's clarity around exactly what the KPIs are to measure against purpose. And when we see the measurement against purpose, it's not just about how consumers are reacting to the purpose, but it's also, as I mentioned, about employees, about partners. So what we've seen work really well with growth triple play companies is they're elevating these KPIs or these metrics, and they're talking about them at a more holistic level. And they're trying to understand, how are my employees, how are future or prospective employees, how are consumers really reacting to our purpose? And that can be done fed through, brand sentiment surveys, for example. But, it's much broader than just looking at what customers are reacting to purpose. It's actually looking across the board. And as I said, it's really powerful when it's elevated up to the C-suite.
You've touched on this, but I want to go back to it because, again, I think it's a perfect question for this audience is, when you're looking at the way the data is being used, the way analytics are being used, is there like an ideal mix of your data, first, second, third party? Is there any sort of benchmarks? Because I think that's something a lot of people really struggle with, wondering, is there a best mix, or is it just so specific that you can't even have that conversation?
And I hope I'm not going against anything anyone said in the last 2 days, but I think it's exactly that. I think that it's a function of where you are, and coming back to what we know for sure with these growth triple play companies is that they are anchoring in a clear data strategy, and your data strategy is your own data strategy. And it's a function of your maturity. It's a function of your development. It's a function of your purpose and where you want to go and how you want to grow. But I think what we've seen, even if it's not about first, second, third party data, as I mentioned, is having proprietary data, and not just about having that proprietary data, but about feeding it back into the organization, being very dynamic. So generating insights about your consumers that no one else has, and then generating that and feeding that back into the organization. And so there's that real-time element also that's important. I think maybe one thing on data, which is slightly anecdotal to what you're asking here, but I think there's something also about making sure that you're thinking about data in a modular way. It's about being practical, but not perfect. And we've seen growth triple play companies starting with 1%, 5%, 7%, 10% of their data, and just building on that in a modular way. So I think it's a combination of those factors of your data strategy is your own, and it's a function of where you are, the industry in, and so on.
I'm sure this will come as a dramatic shock to both you and to our audience that many organizations remain pretty siloed. And when you talk about these three areas, I feel like these are kind of the most infamous silos that can be broken up and have very little communication with each other. When you talk about your creativity lives in one department, your analytics live in another, and your purpose lives in another that puts out like one annual report a year. That was like 20 years ago. That was kind of how everything worked. Are you seeing this awakening to the to really bridging those? And I guess whose job is that? Is it increasingly the CMOs that are being tasked with finding that bridge?
Absolutely. So what we've seen is that the CMO is acting as a unifier, and they're leading from the front of the organization. So the CEO is looking towards the CMO, and the CMO is actually stepping into that role. And it's a CMO who's rallying the organization around purpose. It's a CMO who's making the tough calls around the portfolio. It's a CMO who's thinking about those partnerships. And we think about the CMO role and marketing in general, it's the unifying role. And that means that it's about working in partnership with the rest of the business. So go outside of sort of marketing, it's marketing with a capital M, go outside of the silo and say, okay, I'm a brand manager, I'm a UX manager, but how is what I'm doing today feeding into the customer experience, which is ultimately what you're trying to drive and drive growth? But it's also about building these partnerships. So how does marketing, the CMO, build a partnership with the chief technology officer with these blurring lines and the increase of digitization and omnichannel? What we found is that companies where the CMO builds a strong relationship with the CTO, they're unlocking all the resources they need to help drive digital or data transformation. So it's really about marketing working shoulder to shoulder with the organization and asking those questions of how can I be involved in product, in an innovation? How does my work contribute to the customer experience?
Yeah, it's really interesting. That I think this surprises young people when they ask me for my advice for starting out their career. And I always say, go down the hall or go down to a different Zoom and meet other departments. Just get to know the other departments, because for one, you'll figure out more about how your company works. But for another, as you get promoted, as those folks move up the ladder, you'll be working in tandem all the time instead of this idea of we're competing, we're different parts of the P&L. Like I think we're finally getting there. There's some optimism that we might actually be working together. It's crazy.
I think you've hit the nail on the head. It's not just about this functional expertise of of marketing with a capital M and spreading out, but it's also these relationships, these bonds, and educating one another. We know that CFOs are more likely to protect the marketing budget if they know what the objectives are, the KPIs are. If you're speaking in a language that helps them understand, it's not about brand sentiment, but it's about how you drive the sort of top line revenue. So really building those informal as well as formal connections are absolutely critical, David.
Well, we've got the $1 million question here for many people, a very literally $1 million question. But before we get to that, if you got any questions or last minute, you can hit us up and I will throw your questions at Biljana. Otherwise, I'll just keep peppering you because I still have tons more with our last few minutes. What do we do? What is if you're walking away, you're listening to this presentation, exactly. I 100% believe that my organization should be uniting creativity, analytics, purpose, and that'll be huge. What can these marketers do between now and moving into 2022 to really start making headway on that?
I think the first thing to do is fire up the growth triple play. So to your point, if you're doing one element of the growth triple play, adding another and adding another will actually help you multiply your growth. So really start to build out or fire up the full growth triple play. I think the second element is exactly as you describe, of start unifying your organization. So take it upon yourself. You have permission from the chief executive officer, from most executives, to actually drive the agenda. So grab a seat at that table, form connections within the business. Maybe the final point, and maybe the least interesting point, is actually empower others through setting up infrastructure. And what we've seen work really well is guidelines and guardrails. So you can't be everywhere all the time, but can you actually embed purpose? Can you actually help understand how to infuse creativity into analytics? And we've seen great playbooks emerging, especially in these virtual times. So think through how you can actually help the organization, empower the organization to actually deliver on the growth triple play.
Well, we've got one really good question here. I'm glad, because I was going to ask this too. I'm glad someone brought it up. Is what do you think, when you look at talent that will be hyper valuable for these organizations over the next few years, what do you think are the factors that really successful companies will be looking for with their new talent, with their growing talent?
A fantastic question. And if we'd asked this question a couple of years ago, we would have said, marketing's changing so much, and just there's been such a proliferation and extension of marketing capabilities and a war for talent. And if you fast forward to today, it's the same situation. And there's never been a better time or a busier time than now to be a marketer. But if I take a step back, I think about it along the dimensions that have been sort of a thread to our conversation. And the first one is looking for marketers who can have that functional, if you like, connectivity across the business. So really thinking about, how do I affect and impact the customer experience, not only in, say, UX or in brand, but how am I connecting the customer experience? And I think it's the soft factors as well, to that point, David, that you raised around, can you build these relationships? How do you, because they are really the unlock for making marketing more prominent in the organization, for making marketing much more a value center rather than a cost center, for unlocking the power of data and so on. So I think it's that element of being able to cross-fertilize across the business in a functional, but also in a more relationship kind of way.
Yeah, and I've been telling folks the last few years, if you figure out user experience, figure out customer experience, you're going to have more job offers lined up than you know what to do with. Those two, you're set almost no matter which aspect of the industry, whether you're going into creative, you're going through data, you want to be a CTO, you want to be a CMO. It really doesn't matter. We've intersected so much that if you're not thinking about those topics, you're not going to be part of a really successful organization over these next few years.
Exactly right.
Well, we're almost out of time. I want to see if we've got any other questions here. This is a good question about how mature do you think marketing teams have gotten and their functions have gotten about, like, where are we in the I feel bad saying maturity, because that implies that the ones who aren't doing it at full speed are immature. But you know what I mean? Like, how far along are most marketing organizations in terms of really being where they need to be on having these functions in place?
In terms of the growth triple play, I mean, 7% of companies have all three in play, but I think it's around 50% or so who have two. So we're seeing this kind of steep incline. So it's a great question on maturity. I think there's a lot more consciousness around these capabilities, and many more companies moving towards the growth triple play. But again, it's still a very small share of companies that are doing all three. This is the elite 7%.
All right. Well, I like to save the easiest question for the end. What are the major trends you expect to see shaping the entire marketing industry in 2022? We'll just go in order of importance and get to see how many. No. So do you have any predictions? I feel like we're in the most unpredictable times in modern history. But what are you, obviously, as a partner of McKinsey, you're the perfect person to answer this question. What do you see coming next year?
You did save the easiest question for last, David. Thank you. I think what's becoming increasingly important with all of this disruption, disruption to brand loyalty, what's becoming more and more important is connecting with customers and consumers on a personal and an emotional level. And I actually wouldn't stop just with customers. I think that one of the big needs is also connecting with your current employees and associates, and also future employees and associates in a more deeper personal way. And we've seen through things like the growth triple play research that if you double down on this purpose and really live purpose in conjunction with creativity analytics, you can actually not only grow, but grow above your peers, even in the most disruptive of times.
Well, this has been such a great conversation. Really appreciate you that sharing this. A lot of this data is out there. If you look up for the Growth Triple Play, you can find how McKinsey has presented this online. A lot of great stuff that we didn't even have time to get into. Biljana Cvetanovski, thank you so much for making time for us today.
Thank you so much, David.